Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 4. This week, we're going to be talking about the historical context of bilingual education and the English-only measures that were executed in the United States. So last week, we talked about translanguaging and how the socio-political context of bilingualism and diglossia around the world. And we also discussed the concept of language ideologies. And this is something that's going to come up again and again, especially for this week. And this is because language ideologies are really what catalyze legislation regarding bilingual education throughout US history, and also in our own kind of imbue our own psyches with certain ideologies as well. So language ideologies influence legislation, which then continue to influence our ideologies, and it's a vicious cycle therein. So just to kind of go back to one of the themes of the semester so far is that this idea of labels as being problematic. So Garcia talks extensively about this and talks about how the labels for people and things are always problematic. So we've talked in length about this idea of language and dialect, and how language is a dialect with an army and a navy. The distinction between a language and a dialect is not entirely linguistic, but is often the result of this kind of socio-political dimension and ideological dimension. We also talked about this idea of code switching, which is the term that we use for alternating between codes or languages when you're speaking, or when multilinguals are speaking, in one, let's say in one sentence, and they switch between two or more languages within one sentence. That has kind of been problematized because it assumes that we have distinct codes and distinct languages and represented in our brain. So this is the label is an issue kind of because we can examine this with respect to diglossia, where we can basically have two distinct languages that we can talk about. But when we talk about languaging and translanguaging as actions or practices, we talk about how these distinctions kind of disappear and they overlap. And so I think a handful of you have talked about in the discussion forum how you wouldn't have necessarily considered yourself bilingual, but everyone else does. Or that is a kind of interesting phenomenon where you might not see the distinct differences between your languages, but outsiders do, because they don't have those representations in their mind. Yeah, let me see. We also talk about labels for people who use multiple languages, like limited English proficiency, LEP, which is used by the government, versus English language learners, which is often a term used by English educators. And then there's another term, emergent bilingual, which focuses on the development of multilingualism in children rather than thinking about one specific language as an end goal. So for this week, we read, did I skip one? Nope. Okay. For this week, we've read a bunch of Crawford chapters that takes you through a, what's the word? What's the word? Well, what's the word for something? Oh my goodness, I'm having a tip of the tongue phenomenon. Well, it's a whirlwind history of 400 years of language policy in the US. Oh my gosh, it's gonna bug me. I'll just blurt it out at the end of the recording. I hope you didn't find it too overwhelming, but it's really important to understand this history, because if we don't understand the sociopolitical context, we can't necessarily understand the language ideologies and also the legislation that really impacts us as English teachers or teachers in general when we're dealing with multilingual students. It's also incredibly depressing. I understand that for sure. So I hope you took the time that you needed. And if you guys have any lingering questions or want to talk about some of the more difficult things that we haven't touched on in class, please let me know. I'm always open to hear your perspectives, and I'd love to help talk through a bunch of the stuff that we didn't get to today in class. I'm going to highlight for you some of these key legislative like timestamps, but I wanted to just kind of yeah, do like is it sticker shot? What is the word I'm looking for? Whistle stop tour. Whistle stop tour. My goodness. Tip of the tongue. It's a hell of a thing. All right. So let me focus. Okay. Okay. There have been huge legislative decisions made over the past, 400 years regarding education of so-called language minority students. So if we go back to the 1600s, in colonial times, bilingualism was super common. And if you talk about language education or the problem of bilingualism, it's kind of constructed as a new problem with new waves of immigrants coming into the country and new language ideological or new ideologies held on particular languages and cultures. So Crawford tells us that in 1664, there are around 18 languages spoken in Manhattan. So you can imagine, as you can imagine, there are more than that spoken in Manhattan today. And oh, by the way, that 18 languages excluded indigenous languages. And then in the late 1600s, bilingual schools, especially German English schools in Pennsylvania, were super common. And there were early attempts to establish a language academy in the US, but they were ignored by the Continental Congress. In the Garcia chapters, we also read about language academies in other parts of the world. So Académie Française, or the Spanish Language Academy, that really governs what counts as a language, which has never existed in the US per se. But what we define as an English language has been kind of prescribed by a number of important political figures throughout our history as well. So in early America, really the main tenet of English proficiency was about American freedom. So we were trying to really distinguish ourselves from the British in those late 1700s to really establish this idea that political liberty was way more important than linguistic homogeneity of the time. But people were advocating for some sort of structure to our language. I mentioned inkhorn terms a few weeks ago, I think, and this is kind of an example of that. Also, Noah Webster of Webster's Dictionary fame was this proponent of a federal English. And there was a lot of work done to really distinguish American English from British English at this time. So there was a conscious effort to do things like spelling changes. So this is the era when we have the change from center, like spelling of the word center from C-E-N-T-R-E to C-E-N-T-E-R. Same with favorite or tire, or things like that. So when there's like very distinct spelling differences, that originated from this time as a differentiating and very much so an identity component of language production. Then we're going to kind of move on to the 1800s, and then in 1803, there was the Louisiana Purchase, which incorporated a huge territory of French and Spanish-speaking people. Bilingual education was very common, and not for just those languages that were incorporated into the United States, the newly formed United States, but other things like German and Swedish, Danish, Italian. And then language-related policies and education policies focused at this time on the promotion of a specific type of national identity, as you can probably guess. So really focusing on this liberty as opposed to homogeneity of a specific language. Meanwhile, so a lot of the time, these policies were really promoting this idea of the psychological or well-being of children, and specific pedagogical practices that needed to focus on children. So this was more about specific methods of language instruction became the source of decision making, as opposed to legislative processes being the source of decision making. So there were early anti-bilingual education measures, but they were tended to be religiously based and stemmed from religious discrimination rather than overtly ethnic or national discrimination. So this was more of a thing of trying to, quote unquote, save certain groups of children and protect their psychological well-being, as opposed to, oh, we need to protect them from learning other languages because then their English might suffer, if that makes sense. Also during this period, many Indigenous communities felt the effects of these let's call them what they are, racist policies. So anti-bilingual policies that were religiously based really targeted a lot of the Indigenous communities, particularly children. So there was the Trail of Tears, which removed Indigenous people from the eastern states and pushed them west. Which decimated just thousands and thousands and thousands of Indigenous people. There was a deliberate act of repression of Native American Indigenous languages and literacy. So this is something where, you see this a lot in colonial practices where there's a supremacy weighed on the English language. And so they would try and, quote unquote, save populations of Indigenous people. And they would do things like, restrict or entirely ban singing in a native language. But instead you could sing in English if you're singing hymns from the Bible. There's just tons of this. And I actually posted a video that I think you would benefit from watching with regards to this. This is when it gets really just like absolutely disgusting. In the early 1900s, there were boarding schools for Indigenous children, where they were forcibly taken from their families and put into these schools so that they could basically be stripped of their native culture and identity. And their primary language socialization was English. And the goal was to Americanize them and, by extension, save them into this Christian into a Christian socialization. And that was inhumane and awful. And the repercussions of that are still being felt because a lot of these were actually closed way later than you would expect, like the 1970s and 80s in the US and Canada. At the same time, there were a number of Indigenous Spanish-speaking people in California and the Southwest who were also subject to this concept of Anglo-nativization. So, and then at the early 20th century, there was a new wave of immigrants who came and settled in the United States. And these people were no longer settling in the farmlands, but this was kind of going along with this urbanization of America. And people were coming to the cities to pursue jobs and employment and resources. And so we saw a little bit of changes in people's attitudes towards the idea of speaking English, but also American became synonymous with speaking English. With the onset of World War I, actually, this is a fascinating idea of how we're getting more and more exposed to other countries and other immigrants, but also language restrictionism banned speaking, quote unquote, enemy languages. So, German. Okay, if you remember, like two slides ago, German English bilingualism was very prominent in the US. And now it was when we started to see schools restrict the teaching of English. And then there was an assimilationist ideology that took hold, where conforming and assimilating for all members of society, including immigrants, was a priority. So we start to see ESL being taken out of schools. So children as new immigrants in the school system, so children as new immigrants in the school system were put through more of a sink or swim kind of model where they were just putting them in English classes and they didn't have support to learn English as a foreign language. There is a pretty cool exception to this, which is the Miami-Dade County Coral Way School, where there was a number of refugees from Cuba. And this is actually one of the early bilingual education programs that had documented success. So when we entered into the late 20th century, late 20th century. Hold on. Yeah, we can see this Coral Way Elementary Bilingual Program actually having some very successful outcomes. So I got ahead of myself because I have the same information on 2 slides. So here we illustrate the Coral Way model as gaining traction for really paving the way for success of bilingual education. And then we enter the 1960s, tides began to change a little bit with the civil rights movement. And so now people are talking about education, and we're talking about turning away from this idea of American equals English and this national loyalty to assimilation and homogeneity. So we were really focusing on trying to have more social and ethnic equity across the United States. This was supported by anti-poverty initiatives of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And another factor that came into play was alongside with this is this ideological landscape. So if you recall a few slides ago, I mentioned how ideology informs legislation and legislation informs ideology. So this cycle was really supported by these anti-poverty initiatives of these administrations, really focusing on societal equity and well-being of individuals. And then another factor really was this idea of the Cold War, which emphasized educational funding and policy initiatives to have us compete on a global level with more international rivals. Here is a timeline of some of the more important educational legislation timeposts, I guess. So of the 20th century. So I'm sure you're familiar with things like the Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation in schools. Then the Civil Rights Act, and there's also the Bilingual Education Act. The other one is Lew versus Nichols, and I appreciated learning this from some Crawford, basically, because any other book that you can read on bilingual education, you get one paragraph, but he really takes us through all the iterations of this policy and how it transformed over a decade. So this is a pretty cool historical perspective for me as well. And then, well, these issues really kind of go back and forth between being super progressive and then also regressive. So in the early 80s, the Reagan administration withdraws some of the progress that we had with bilingual and multilingual access and equity and support in our education system, and a very clear, again, assimilation, Anglo-nativist, like English supremacy focus was instilled starting in the 80s. In a similar vein, there is this lobbying group that works incredibly hard to basically create English as the official language of the United States. So this was founded by Senator Hayakawa in California in 1981, and it views bilingualism as a social problem rather than an educational or civil right. So if you recall from our previous week's slides, we talk about how bilingualism has been perceived in the US, and this is one of those instances where bilingualism was perceived as a problem rather than a resource. which is how a lot of us think about it today. So, yeah, so in the 60s to the 80s and 90s, we see a real shift about thinking about language rights as something as a problem. We've already talked about this when talking about Garcia. So this is an example from an advertising campaign from this organization called US English. And it's fascinating. And the advertising that they do is, I just got this off their website. So it's pretty upsetting. So I'll let you all read this, and again, would love to hear what you think about this. And let's take your time, pause the video and read this. Here's another timeline of our progress in language policy developments since the 80s. So we've got multiple states outlawing bilingual education, including California, Arizona, Massachusetts. But you can see here that it wasn't until the 2017 where Massachusetts overturned this idea of Q2, the rejection of bilingual education. Yeah, these are really important. Again, it's pretty clear cut as I've written them out, but this is a fascinating timeline of progress and some other regressive instances. So let us talk about, wait, what is this? Oh, sorry, that's from a template. Let's talk about what we learned from the chapters. So Crawford really details the long and at times disturbing and painful history of language education in the US. And we learned that there's a long history of subjugating minorities for multiple grounds, for things like religious sanctity and Anglo superiority, political beliefs, cultural practices. And it's really fascinating that, okay, I really want to hammer this in. It's not the language per se that is the reason for subjugation. It is more about the cultural and societal aspects of the people who speak those languages as opposed to the languages themselves. So this goes into this idea of indexing or indexicality. So indexicality is this phenomenon where a language variety, or I'm sorry, that's supposed to be or, an aspect of language thereof, e.g. a specific pronunciation, points to or indexes a member-specific I'm so sorry, I'm reading ahead of myself. Let me restart. Indexicality is when a language or variety or an aspect thereof, so a specific pronunciation of a language, points to, aka indexes, a speaker's membership in some social group. So if I were to say, Pak the Ka and Havad Yad, this indexes what? Okay, that I am potentially a member of Boston social group. Maybe that I am lower income. Maybe that I am working, no, let's say working class or blue collar, all these phrases, right? Does it index that I am white? Maybe. Does it index that I am, I don't know, it's things like that. So what's really fascinating about this Pak the Ka and Havad Yad example is that we're talking about R-lessness. Yeah. So if I were to say Pak the Ka, and then Emily Blunt comes in and says Pak the Ka, there is not the same indexing because people perceive the British R-lessness as being more posh than the Boston R-lessness, if that makes sense. So, so the question for you all, I'm sorry if this is like a little like giving you motion sickness, but I just realized I could do this. Why does Boston R-lessness index something, whereas British R-lessness does not. So when you have something that is indexed by a specific pronunciation, it's not that feature. It's not R-lessness that people deem as lesser than. It's the person speaking it, or it's the social group that it represents. So another example that I come across in my research is the phenomenon of saying ax for ask. So when ax is a phenomenon that is actually fairly common in a number of social groups, not just people who speak Black English. So it is a phenomenon that you see in white speakers as well, but it is incredibly pathologized and discriminated against purely because it is also synonymous with a population of Black speakers, right? Black English speakers. So when we're talking about indexicality, I really want you to remember that this is this idea of pointing to. So when a language feature points to or indexes a person's membership of some social group, and when people have language ideologies that really inform bilingual education, it illustrates that the discrimination isn't towards the group of isn't towards the non-native English pronunciation, or I'm sorry, non-native English proficiency, but the groups that have that non-native English proficiency. Okay. I hope I made myself clear. I don't want to be too verbose on this one subject, so please let me know if you have any questions. Yes, okay. Next week, great. This is a great place to stop. So we're going to be talking about policy and politics around bilingual education, continuing on and taking a bit of a deeper dive. And you have two Crawford chapters and then a Garcia chapter. You can really focus on that group of pages right there. And I wanted to also highlight that I've uploaded a video on YouTube. It's an hour long and is basically a film called As American as Public Schools from 1900 to 1950. And it really talks about the early half of the 20th century for people who came to school speaking a language other than English, and most of it regarding the indigenous populations and learning more about the boarding schools therein. So I am excited to see what we all talk about on the discussion board, and thank you all for indulging me. If I got a little soapboxy, it's very important that you hear these perspectives about language policy. And yes, thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I look forward to continuing this conversation on our discussion board. Thank you so much. Have a great week. Bye-bye.